The Story of Civilization, Volume 3, Caesar and Christ, Part 2, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 5, Side 2. 4 classes composed the population. 1. Bondsmen, some of them slaves, most of them serfs bound to the soil and obliged to pay the landowner in produce. 2. Freedmen, unfranchised renters. 3. Freemen, landowners and warriors. And 4. Nobles, landowners who traced their pedigrees to the gods but based their power upon substantial patrimonies and armed bodyguards, comites, companions, or counts. The tribal assembly was composed of nobles, guards, and freemen. They came in arms, chose the chief or king, approved the proposals submitted to them by clashing their spears, or rejected them by a majority of grunts. The second and third classes were partly engaged in handicrafts and the metallurgical industries, in which the Germans excelled. The fourth provided the lords and knights and chivalry of feudal Germany. Very little cultural superstructure was added to this simple social organization. Religion had at this time barely emerged from nature worship into the cult of anthropomorphic deities. Tacitus calls them Mars, Mercury, and Hercules, probably Tiu, or Tyre, Woden, or Odin, and Donar, or Thor. We still unwittingly commemorate them, and Freya, the goddess of love, on 4 days of every week. There was a virgin goddess Hertha, or Mother Earth, impregnated by a sky god, and every imagination and need was supplied by a varied population of fairies, elves, kobolds, nixes, giants, and dwarfs. Human sacrifice was offered to Woden, perhaps tastier animals to other gods. Worship was conducted in the open air in forests and groves, for the Germans thought it absurd to confine a nature spirit in an abode built by human hands. There was no powerful sacerdotal class like the Druids of Gaul or Britain, but there were priests and priestesses who presided over religious ceremonies, sat as judges in criminal cases, and divined the future by studying the motions and neighings of white horses. As in Gaul, there were bards who sang in rude verse the legends and history of their tribes. A small minority could read and write, and adapted the Latin characters to form the runes that served for their alphabet. Art was primitive, but skillful work was done in gold. When Rome withdrew her legions from Germany, she retained control of the Rhine from source to mouths, and divided the majestic valley into 2 provinces, Upper and Lower Germany. The latter included Holland and the Rhineland south to Cologne. This once lovely city, known to the Romans as Colonia Agrippinensis, had been made a colony in AD 50 in honor of Nero's mother, who had been born there. Half a century later, it was the most opulent settlement on the Rhine. The province of Upper Germany followed the Rhine southward through Moguntiacum, now Mayence, Aequi Aurelii, now Baden-Baden, Argentoratum, now Strasbourg, and Augusta Roricorum, now Augst, to Vindonissa, now Vindisch. Nearly all these towns had the usual array of temples, basilicas, theaters, baths, and public statuary. Many of the legionaries sent by Rome to guard the Rhine lived outside their camps, married German girls, and remained as citizens when their term of service was complete. The Rhineland was probably as thickly settled and affluent in Roman days as at any time before the 19th century. Between the Rhine and the Danube, as we have seen, Rome's military engineers built a fortified road, or limes, with a fortress every 9 miles, and 300 miles of wall. It served Rome for a century, but availed little when the Roman birth rate fell too far below the German. Still weaker as a frontier was the Danube, which the ancients considered the longest river in the world. South of it lay the half-barbarous provinces of Rhaetia, Noricum, and Pannonia, approximately composing what our youth knew as Austria-Hungary and Serbia. On the site of modern Augsburg, that is Augustus's town, the Romans established a colony, Augusta Vendelicorum, as a main station on the road from Italy over the Brenner Pass to the Danube. On the river they built 2 fortress cities, at Vindobona, now Vienna, and at Aquincum, on the heights from which Buda looks down upon Pest. In southeastern Pannonia, on the Save River west of the modern Belgrade, the city of Sirmium, now Mitrovica, rose to be in Diocletian's time one of the 4 imperial capitals. South of Pannonia, in the province of Dalmatia, the commercial energy of Greeks, Romans, and natives had developed the Adriatic ports of Salona, now Spalato, Apollonia, near Valona, and Dyrrachium, now Durazzo. From these provinces below the Danube came Imperial Rome's sturdiest soldiers, and in the 3rd century the martial emperors who would for 200 years hold back the barbarian avalanche. East of Pannonia lay Dacia, now Romania, with its now-vanished capital of Sarmizegetusa. South and east of this, Mysia, now parts of Yugoslavia, Romania, and Bulgaria, boasted 2 cities on the Danube, Singadunum, now Belgrade, and Trismus, now Iglitsa, one near the Isker, Sardica, now Sofia, and 3 major towns on the Black Sea, Istris, Tomai, now Constanta, and Odessus, now Varna. In these harassed settlements, Greek civilization and Roman arms struggled in vain to maintain themselves against the Goths, Sarmatians, Huns, and other barbarian tribes breeding and wandering north of the great stream. It was Rome's inability to civilize these provinces south of the Danube that led to her fall. The task was too great for a people suffering from old age. The vitality of the master race was ebbing in sterile comfort, while the tribes of the north were advancing in reckless health. When Trajan subsidized the Sarmatians to keep the peace, it was the beginning of the end. When Marcus Aurelius brought thousands of Germans into the empire as settlers, the dikes were down. German soldiers were welcomed into the Roman army and rose to positions of command. German families multiplied in Italy while Italian families died. In this process, the movement of Romanization was reversed. The barbarians were barbarizing Rome. Nevertheless, it was a magnificent and precious achievement that the West, if not the North, had been won for the classical heritage. There, at least, the arts of peace had emerged from the travail of war, and men could turn their swords into plowshares without decaying in urban ease and slums. Out of the earthy vigor of Spain and Gaul, a new civilization would rise when the barbarian flood would fall, and the seed of despot centuries would come to fruit and pardon in the lands where the merciless legions had brought the law of Rome and the enkindling light of Greece. Chapter 23. Roman Greece. 1. Plutarch. Rome tried hard to be generous to Greece and did not quite fail. No garrisons were placed in the new province of Achaia. Less was exacted from it than its own tax-gatherers had claimed before. The city-states were allowed to govern themselves by their old constitutions and laws, and many of them, Athens, Sparta, Plataea, Delphi, and others, were free cities, exempt from all restrictions except the right to wage foreign or class war. Nevertheless, hungry for its ancient liberties, and bled by Roman generals, moneylenders, and businessmen skilled in buying cheap and selling dear, Greece joined in Mithridates' revolt and paid the heaviest penalty. Athens suffered a devastating siege, and Delphi, Elis, and Epidaurus were pillaged of their sanctuary hoards. A generation later, Caesar and Pompey, then Antony and Brutus, fought their duels on Greek territory, conscripted Greek men, requisitioned Greek crops and gold, levied 20 years' taxes in 2, and left the cities destitute. Under Augustus, Greek Asia recovered, but Greece herself remained poor, ruined not so much by the Roman conquest as by a stifling despotism in Sparta, a chaotic freedom in Athens, a blighting sterility in soil and men. Her most enterprising sons deserted her for younger and richer lands. The rise of new powers in Egypt, Carthage, and Rome, and the development of industry in the Hellenistic East left the homeland of the classic spirit outmoded and forlorn. Rome loaded Greece with compliments and ravaged her art. Scaurus took 3,000 statues for his theater, Caligula ordered the husband of his mistress to comb Greece for statuary, and Nero alone took half the sculptures of Delphi. Not till Hadrian would Athens smile again. Epirus bore the brunt of Rome's anger in the Macedonian wars. The Senate delivered it to the rapine of the soldiers, and 150,000 Epirots were sold as slaves. Augustus built a new capital for Epirus at Nicopolis to celebrate his triumph at nearby Actium. Civilization must have had some homage there, since the city of victory gave Epictetus an audience and a home. Macedonia fared better than its loyal neighbor. It was rich in minerals and timber, and its commercial life was quickened by the Via Egnatia that spanned it and Thrace from Apollonia and Dyrrachium to Byzantium. On this great highway, still in part preserved, lay the chief cities of the province: Edessa, Pella, and Thessalonica. This last, known to us as Salonica, but to modern Greeks by its ancient name, victory of Thessaly, was the capital of the province, seat of the provincial council, and one of the great ports of trade between the Balkans and Asia. Thrace, farther east, devoted itself to agriculture, herding, and mining, but it had considerable cities at Serdica, now Sofia, Philippopolis, its capital, Adrianople, Perinthus, and Byzantium, now Istanbul. Here at the Golden Horn the merchants and fishmongers grew rich, while the Greek settlers of the hinterland gave way to the encroaching barbarians. All the grain of the interior came down to its docks, all the commerce of Scythia and the Black Sea paid toll as it passed by, and the fish almost leaped into the net as they poured through the narrow Bosporus. Soon Constantine would recognize this site as the key city of the classic world. Thessaly, south of Macedonia, specialized in wheat and fine horses. Euboea, the great island named of old, like Boeotia, for its fine cattle, was described by Dio Chrysostom as reverting to barbarism in our 2nd century. Here, above all, the discouragement of the poor by the concentration of land and wealth in the hands of a few families, the discouragement of the rich by ever-rising taxes and liturgies, and the discouragement of parentage by selfish wealth and desperate poverty had almost wiped out a once thriving agricultural population, and cattle grazed within the walls of Chalcis and Eretria. Boeotia had not recovered from the death and taxes laid upon it by Sulla's campaigns. Thebes, said Strabo, is only a village, huddled into what had once been merely its Cadmea or citadel. A century of peace, however, brought some prosperity to Plataea, and Chaeronea, on whose plains Philip and Sulla had won empires, retained enough charm to keep its most famous citizen. It had become so small, said Plutarch, that he would not make it smaller by leaving it. In his calm career and genial thought, we find a fairer side of a somber scene, a decent middle class clinging to ancient virtues, capable of civic devotion, warm friendship, and parental love. There is no more pleasant character in our tale than Plutarch of Chaeronea. He was born there about A.D. 46 and died there about 126. He was a student at Athens when Nero collected triumphs in Greece. He must have had a fair income, for he traveled in Egypt and Asia Minor and twice in Italy. He lectured in Greek at Rome and seems to have served his country in some diplomatic role. He liked the great capital and the good manners and honorable life of its new aristocracy. He admired their Stoic code, and agreed with Ennius that Rome had been made by morality and character. As he contemplated these living nobles and the noble dead, the thought came to him of comparing the heroes of Rome with those of Greece. He proposed not merely to write history or even biography, but to teach virtue and heroism by historic exemplars. Even his parallel lives were in his mind Moralia. He was always a teacher and never lost a chance to tie a moral to a tale, but who has ever done it more gracefully? He warns us in his Alexander that he is more interested in character than in history. He hopes that by pairing and comparing great Romans with great Greeks, he will pass on some moral stimulus, some heroic impulse to his readers. With disarming candor he confesses that he himself has become a better man through keeping company so long with distinguished men. We must not expect to find in him the conscience and accuracy of a proper historian. He is rich in errors of name and place and date, and occasionally, if we may judge, misunderstands events. He even fails in 2 major tasks of the biographer: to show the derivation of his subject's character and work from heredity, environment, and circumstance, and the development of character through growth, responsibility, and crisis. In Plutarch, as in Heraclitus, a man's character is his fate. But no one who has read the lives can feel their shortcomings. These are lost in the vivid narrative, the exciting episodes, the fascinating anecdotes, the wise comments, the noble style. In all these 1,500 pages there is not a line of padding. Every sentence counts. 100 eminent men, generals, poets, and philosophers, have borne witness to the book. It is, said Madame Roland, the pasture of great souls. I can hardly do without Plutarch, wrote Montaigne. It is my breviary. Shakespeare takes many stories here, and his view of Brutus goes back through Plutarch to Roman aristocrats. Napoleon carried the lives with him almost everywhere, and Heine, reading them, could hardly restrain himself from leaping upon a horse and riding forth to conquer France. Greece has not left us a more precious book. Having seen the Mediterranean world, Plutarch returned to Chaeronea, raised 4 sons and a daughter, lectured and wrote, journeyed now and then to Athens, but for the most part shared to the end of his days the simple life of his native town. He thought it an obligation to combine public office with his scholarly pursuits. His fellow citizens elected him building inspector, then chief magistrate, then beotarch, member of the National Council. He presided over municipal ceremonies and festivals, and became in his spare moments a priest of the revived oracle at Delphi. He thought it unwise to reject the old faith because of its intellectual incredibility. The vital thing was not the creed, but the support it gave to man's weak morality, the reinforcing bond it wove among the members and generations of a family and a state. The thrill of religious emotion was in his judgment the most deepening experience of life. Tolerant as well as pious, he almost founded the study of comparative religion by his treatises on Roman and Egyptian cults. All deities, he argued, are aspects of one supreme being, timeless, indescribable, so far removed from earthly and temporal affairs that intermediary spirits, or daimones, must create and regulate the world. There are also evil spirits, marshaled by some master demon who is the source and soul of all the chaos, irrationality, and viciousness in nature and man. It is good, Plutarch thought, to believe in personal immortality, a rewarding heaven, a cleansing purgatory, a punishing hell. He was comforted by the possibility that a stay in purgatory might purify even Nero, and that only a few would suffer eternal damnation. He denounced the terrors of superstition as worse than atheism, but he accepted divination, oracles, necromancy, and the prophetic power of dreams. He did not pretend to be an original philosopher. Like Apuleius and so many others of that age, he described himself as an adapter of Plato. He condemned the Epicureans for replacing the fear of hell with the gloom of annihilation, and criticized the repugnances of Stoicism. But he held, like a Stoic, that to follow God and to obey reason are the same thing. His lectures and essays have properly been collected under the title Moralia, for most of them are simple and genial preachments on the wisdom of life. They discuss everything, from the advisability of keeping old men in public office to the priority of the chicken or the egg. Plutarch is fond of his library, but confesses that good health is more precious than good books. Some men, led by gluttony, rush off to join in drinking bouts as if they were laying in provisions for a siege. The less expensive foods are always more helpful. When, in a precipitate retreat, Artaxerxes Memnon had nothing to eat but barley bread and figs, he exclaimed, "What a pleasure is this, which has never been mine before!" Wine is the most beneficial of beverages, provided there is a happy combination of it with the occasion as well as with water. Especially to be feared are indigestions arising from meats, for they are depressing at the outset, and a pernicious residue from them remains behind. It is best to accustom the body not to require meat in addition to other food, for the earth yields in abundance many things not only for nourishment but for comfort and enjoyment. But since custom has become a sort of unnatural second nature, our use of meat should be as a prop and support of our diet. We should use other foods, more in accord with nature, and less dulling to the reasoning faculty, which, as it were, is kindled from plain and light substances. He follows Plato in advocating equal opportunity for women, and gives many examples of cultured ladies in antiquity. There were some in his own circle. But he views adultery by the man with all the lenience of a pagan male. If a man in private life, who is incontinent and dissolute in regard to his pleasures, commits some peccadillo with a paramour or maidservant, his wedded wife ought not to be indignant or angry, but she should reason that it is respect for her that leads him to share his licentiousness with another woman. Nevertheless, we rise from these charming essays warmed by the fellowship of a man humane, essentially wholesome, and complete. We are not offended by the commonness of his ideas. His moderation is a welcome antidote to the ideological hysteria of our time. His good sense, his kindly humor, and his engaging illustrations carry us on unresisting, even over the shoals of his platitudes. It is refreshing to find a philosopher who is wise enough to be happy. Let us be thankful, he counsels us, for the common boons and graces of life, and feel them none the less gladly for their permanence. We must not forget those blessings and comforts which we share with many more, but must joy in this, that we live, that we have our health, that we behold the light of the sun. Will not the good man consider every day a festival? For the world is the most august of temples, and most worthy of its Lord. Into this temple man is introduced at his birth, into the presence not of statues made with hands and motionless, but such as the divine mind has manifested to our senses, even the sun, moon, and stars, and the rivers ever pouring forth fresh water, and the earth producing food. As this life is the most perfect of initiations into the most exalted of mysteries, we should ever be filled with good cheer and rejoicing. 2. Indian Summer. Plutarch exemplifies two movements of his time, the return to religion and the passing renaissance of Greek literature and philosophy. The former was universal, the latter was confined to Athens and the Greek East. 6 cities of the Peloponnesus prospered, but contributed little to Greek thought. Western commerce and a busy textile industry kept Patria alive through Roman and medieval history, even to our day. Olympia throve on the leavings of tourists coming to see Phidias's Zeus or the Olympic Games. It is one of the pleasantest aspects of Greek history that these quadrennial contests continued from 776 BC to AD 394, when Theodosius ended them. As in the days of Prodicus and Herodotus, philosophers and historians came to harangue the crowd assembling for the festival. Dio Chrysostom describes authors reading their stupid compositions to transient listeners, poets reciting their verses, rhetoricians thumping the air, and sophists in great number, like gorgeous peacocks, coming to blow their wind over the multitude. He proved no more silent than the rest. Epictetus pictures the spectators cramped and sweltering in the unshaded stands, burned by the sun or drenched by the rain, but forgetting everything in the tumult and the shouting that marked the final moments of each bout or race. The old Nemean, Isthmian, Pythian, and Pan-Athenaic games continued. New ones were added, like the Pan-Hellenia of Hadrian, and many of them included competitions in poetry, oratory, or music. "Can you not hear classical music at the great festivals?" asks a character in Lucian. Gladiatorial combats were introduced to Greece by the Roman colony at Corinth. Thence they spread to other cities, until even the theatre of Dionysus was befouled with butchery. Many Greeks, Dio Chrysostom, Lucian, Plutarch, protested against the desecration. Demonax, the Cynic philosopher, begged the Athenians not to allow the innovation until they had thrown down the altar of pity at Athens. But the Roman games continued in Greece till predominantly Christian times. Sparta and Argos were still moderately alive, and Epidaurus grew rich on the visits of sick bodies and souls to the shrine of Asclepius. Corinth, controlling the trade across the isthmus, became within half a century of its re-establishment by Caesar the wealthiest city in Greece. Its heterogeneous population of Romans, Greeks, Syrians, Jews, and Egyptians, most of them uprooted from their native lands and morals, was notorious for commercialism, Epicureanism, and immorality. The old temple of Aphrodite Pandemos carried on an undiminished trade as the shrine and center of Corinthian prostitutes. Apuleius describes a gorgeous ballet that he saw in Corinth, representing the judgment of Paris. Venus appeared all naked, save that her fine and comely middle was lightly covered with a thin silken smock, and this the wanton wind blew hither and thither. Corinth had not mended her ways since Aspasia. Passing through Megara into Attica, the rural scene was one of great poverty. Deforestation, erosion, and mineral depletion had been added to war, emigration, taxation, and race suicide to make a desert of the Roman peace. 2 cities alone in Attica were prosperous: Eleusis, whose sacramental mysteries drew lucrative crowds to her every year, and Athens, the educational and intellectual center of the classic world. Its ancient institutions, council, assembly, and archons, still functioned, and Rome had restored the Areopagus to its primeval authority as the seat of judgment and the citadel of property rights. Rulers like Antiochus IV, Herod the Great, Augustus, and Hadrian rivaled millionaires like Herodes Atticus in benefactions to the city. Herodes rebuilt the stadium in marble, almost exhausting Pentelicus, and raised an Odeon, or music hall, at the foot of the Acropolis. Hadrian provided funds to complete the Olympium, and Zeus, who now had one foot in the grave, received a home worthy of his Casanova prime. Meanwhile, the unrivaled fame of Athens in letters, philosophy, and education brought a stream of rich youths and needy scholars to her schools. The University of Athens consisted of 10 professorships, endowed by the city or the emperor, and a host of private lecturers and tutors. Instruction was given in literature, philology, rhetoric, philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and law, usually in gymnasia or theaters, sometimes in temples or homes. Except in oratory or law, the curriculum had no thought of equipping the student to earn a living. It sought rather to sharpen his mind, deepen his understanding, and provide him with a moral code. It produced many brilliant intellects, but it also generated thousands of cobweb spinners who would turn both philosophy and religion into a maze of controversial theories. As Athens depended for a considerable part of its income on the students, it put up patiently with their hilarious ways. Freshmen were hazed with practical jokes that sometimes injured citizens. The students of rival professors became ardent partisans and attacked one another in occasional riots like the cane rushes of our youth. Some students felt that they could learn more from the courtesans and gamblers of the town than from all teachers of philosophy, and we gather from Alciphron that the ladies in question looked upon the professors as dull and incompetent competitors. But there was often a pleasant bond of friendship between learners and teachers. Many of these invited students to dinner, guided their reading, visited them in illness, and kept their parents misinformed about their progress. Most of the lecturers lived on fees paid by each disciple. A small number of professors drew a salary from the state, and the heads of the 4 schools of philosophy received 10,000 drachmas, or $6,000 a year, from the imperial treasury. Under these stimuli, the period of the second sophistic developed. A revival of the orator-philosopher passing from city to city as honorariums might beckon, delivering addresses, teaching pupils, pleading cases in the courts, living in rich homes as spiritual counselors, and sometimes acting as honored emissaries of their city-states. The movement flourished throughout the empire, but especially in the Greek world in the first 3 centuries of our era. Philosophers were then, says Dio, as numerous as cobblers. The new sophists, like the old, had no common doctrine, phrased their teaching eloquently, drew large audiences, and attained in many cases high social status, imperial favor, or great wealth. They differed from the earlier sophists in seldom questioning religion or morality. They were more interested in form and style, in oratorical technique and skill, than in the great questions that had shaken the beliefs and morals of the world. Indeed, the new sophists were warm defenders of the ancient faith. Philostratus has preserved for us the lives of the leading sophists of this age. Let one example suffice. Adrian of Tyre studied rhetoric at Athens and rose to the state chair of rhetoric there. He opened his inaugural address with the proud words, "Once again letters have come from Phoenicia." He rode to his lectures in a carriage with silver harness, in rich attire and gleaming with gems. When Marcus Aurelius visited Athens, he tested Adrian by asking him to improvise an oration on a difficult theme. Adrian carried the matter off so well that Marcus loaded him with honors, silver and gold, houses and slaves. Promoted to the chair of rhetoric at Rome, Adrian's lectures, though in Greek, proved so alluring that senators adjourned their sessions and the populace deserted the pantomimes to go and hear him. Such a career almost announces the death of philosophy. It had been swallowed up in an ocean of rhetoric, and had ceased to think when it learned to speak. At the other extreme were the Cynics. We have described them elsewhere, their tattered cloak, their unkempt hair and beard, their wallet and staff, their reduction of life to simplicities, sometimes obscenities. They lived like mendicant friars, had a hierarchical organization with novices and superiors, avoided marriage and work, scorned the conventions and artificialities of civilization, denounced all governments as thieves and superfluities, laughed at all oracles, mysteries, and gods. Everyone satirized them, Lucian most savagely, yet even Lucian admired Demonax, a cultured cynic who had abandoned his wealth to live in philosophical poverty. He gave his century of life, from AD 50 to 150, to helping others, reconciling hostile individuals and cities, and Athens, which ridiculed everything, respected him. Indicted before an Athenian court for refusing to offer sacrifice to the gods, he won acquittal by saying simply that the gods had no need of offerings, and that religion consisted in kindness to all. When the Athenian assembly was engaged in a quarrel of factions, his mere appearance sufficed to quiet the dispute, whereupon he left without having uttered a word. It was his custom in old age to enter any house uninvited and eat and sleep there, and every home in Athens sought the honor. Lucian speaks with less sympathy of Peregrinus, who tried Christianity, abandoned it for the Cynic regimen, denounced Rome, called all Greece to revolt, and astonished an assemblage at Olympia by making and lighting his own funeral pyre, leaping into it and allowing himself to be consumed in the flames. This in AD 165. In such scorn of wealth and life, the Cynics were paving a way for the monks of the Christian Church. When Vespasian, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius established chairs of philosophy at Athens, they ignored the Cynics and the Skeptics, and recognized only 4 schools of thought: the Platonic Academy, the Aristotelian Lyceum, the Stoics, and the Epicureans. The Academy had diluted Plato's proud faith in reason into the universal doubt of Carneades. But after the latter's death, the school reacted toward orthodoxy, and Antiochus of Ascalon, who taught Cicero at the Academy in 79 B.C., returned to Plato's conceptions of reason, immortality, and God. The Lyceum was now devoting itself to natural science in the tradition of Theophrastus, or to pious commentaries on Aristotle's works. The school of Epicurus was declining in this religious age. Few men dared profess its doctrines without diplomatic reservations. In most of Greek Asia, the words Epicurean, atheist, and Christian were synonyms expressive of horror and desecration. The dominant philosophy had long since been Stoicism. The rigorous perfectionism of its early forms had been softened by Panetius and Posidonius, both citizens of Rhodes. Returning to Athens after Scipio's death in 129 B.C., Panetius, now head of the Stoa, defined God as a material spirit or breath, or pneuma, permeating all things, appearing in plants as the power of growth, in animals as soul or psyche, in man as reason or logos. His successors developed this vague pantheism into a more definitely religious philosophy. The Stoic theory of moral discipline moved closer to Cynic asceticism, and in the 2nd century A.D. Cynicism, as one observer put it, differed from Stoicism only by a torn cloak. In Epictetus, as in Marcus Aurelius, we see both movements advancing toward Christianity. 3. Epictetus. Epictetus was born at Hierapolis in Phrygia about A.D. 50, a slave woman's son, and therefore himself a slave. He had little chance of education, for he was passed from one owner and city to another, until he found himself the property of Epictetus, a powerful freedman in Nero's court. He was of feeble health and lame, apparently through the brutality of one of his masters, but he lived the normal 60 years and 10. Epictetus allowed him to attend the lectures of Musonius Rufus, and later freed him. Epictetus must himself have set up as a teacher in Rome, for when Domitian banished the philosophers, Epictetus was among those who fled. He settled in Nicopolis and drew to his lectures there students from many parts. One was Arrian of Nicomedia, later governor of Cappadocia. Arrian took down the words of Epictetus, probably in shorthand, and published them as diatribae, rubbings or copies, now on all lists of the world's best books as the Discourses. It is no dull formal treatise, but a classic of simple speech and bluff humor, intimately expressing a modest and kindly, yet sharp and vigorous character. Epictetus applied his lusty sarcasms to himself and others impartially, and gaily mocked his rough-and-tumble style. He made no complaint when Demonax, hearing that the old bachelor counseled marriage, sarcastically petitioned for his daughter's hand. He excused himself on the ground that teaching wisdom is as great a service as begetting 2 or 3 pug-nosed children. In later years he took a wife to help him care for an infant that he had rescued from exposure. In those years his fame compassed the empire, and Hadrian counted him among his friends. Epictetus, resembling Socrates in this as in so many other ways, cared too little about physics or metaphysics to construct a system of thought. His one subject and passion was the good life. "What do I care," he asks, "whether all existing things are composed of atoms or of fire and earth? Is it not enough to learn the true nature of good and evil?" Philosophy does not mean reading books about wisdom. It means training oneself in the practice of wisdom. The essence of the matter is that a man should so mold his life and conduct that his happiness shall depend as little as possible upon external things. This does not require a hermit's solitude. On the contrary, Epicureans and blackguards are to be condemned for detaching men from public service. The good man will take his part in civic affairs, but he will accept with equanimity all vicissitudes of fortune: poverty, bereavement, humiliation, pain, slavery, imprisonment, or death. He will know how to endure and renounce. Never say about anything, "I have lost it," but only, "I have given it back." Is your child dead? It has been given back. Is your wife dead? She has been returned. I have had my farm taken away. Very well, this too has been given back. So long as God gives it to you, take care of it as something not your own. Alas, that I should be lame in one leg. Slave, do you then because of one paltry leg blame the universe? Will you not make a free gift of it to the whole? I must go into exile. Does anyone keep me from going with a smile, serene? I will throw you into prison. It is only my body you imprison. I must die. Must I then die complaining? These are the lessons that philosophy ought to rehearse and write down daily and practice. A platform or a prison are places, one high, the other low, but your moral purpose can be kept the same in either place. The slave can be spiritually free like Diogenes. The prisoner can be free like Socrates. The emperor can be a slave like Nero. Even death is a minor incident in the good man's life. He may advance its coming if he finds that evil too heavily outweighs good. In any case, he will receive it calmly as part of the secret wisdom of nature. If heads of grain had feeling, ought they to pray that they should never be harvested? I would have you know that it is a curse never to die. The ship goes down. What then am I to do? Whatever I can. I drown without fear, neither shrinking nor crying out against God, but recognizing that what is born must also perish. For I am a part of the whole, as an hour is part of a day. I must come on as the hour, and like an hour pass away. Regard yourself as but a single thread of all that go to make up the garment. Seek not that the things which happen to you should happen as you wish, but wish the things that happen to be as they are, and you will find tranquility. Though he often speaks of nature as an impersonal force, Epictetus as frequently infuses his conception with personality, intelligence, and love. The atmosphere of religion pervading his age warms his philosophy to a self-surrendering piety akin to that of the Stoic emperor who would soon read him and echo his thought. He speaks with a fine eloquence of the majestic order prevailing in time and space, and the evidences of design in nature. But he proceeds to explain that God has created some animals to be eaten, others to serve in farming, others to produce cheese. The human mind itself, he thinks, is so marvelous an instrument that only a divine creator could have brought it into being. Indeed, so far as we possess reason, we are parts of the world reason. If we could trace our ancestry back to the first man, we should find him begotten by God. God is therefore literally the father of us all, and all men are brothers. He who has once observed with understanding the administration of the world, and has learned that the greatest and most comprehensive community is the system of men and God, and that from God came the seeds whence all things, and especially rational beings, spring, why should not that man call himself a citizen of the world, nay, a son of God? If a man could only subscribe heart and soul to this doctrine, I think he would entertain no mean or ignoble thought in himself. Bear in mind, then, when you eat, who you are that eat, and whom you are nourishing. When you cohabit with women, who you are that do this. You are bearing God about with you, you poor wretch, and know it not. In a passage that St. Paul might have written, Epictetus exhorts his students not only to submit their wills trustingly to God's, but to be the apostles of God among mankind. God says, "Go and bear witness for me." Think what it is to be able to say, "God has sent me into the world to be his soldier and witness, to tell men that their sorrows and fears are vain, that to a good man no evil can befall, whether he live or die. God sends me at one time here, at another time there. He disciplines me by poverty and imprisonment, that I may be the better witness to him among men. With such a ministry committed to me, can I any longer care in what place I am, or who my companions are, or what they say about me? Nay, rather, does not my whole nature strain after God, his laws and commandments? As for himself, he is filled with awe and gratitude by the mystery and splendor of things, and he intones to the Creator a pagan Magnificat that is one of the supreme passages in the history of religion. What language is adequate to praise all the works of Providence? If we had sense, ought we to be doing anything else, publicly or privately, than hymning and praising the Deity, and rehearsing his benefits? Ought we not, as we dig and plow and eat, to sing a hymn of praise to God? What then? Since most of you have become blind, ought there not to be someone to fulfill this office for you, and in behalf of all sing hymns of praise to God? Though we have here no word for immortality, and can trace all these ideas back to the Stoics and the Cynics, we find in these pages remarkable parallels to many attitudes of early Christianity. Epictetus indeed sometimes advances beyond Christianity. He denounces slavery, condemns capital punishment, and wishes to have criminals treated as sick men. He advocates a daily examination of conscience, and announces a kind of golden rule. When you shun to suffer, do not make others suffer. And he adds, if a man is reported to have spoken ill of you, make no defense, but say, he did not know the rest of my faults, else he would not have mentioned only these. He advises men to return good for evil, and to submit when reviled, to fast now and then, and abstain from the things you desire. Sometimes he speaks of the body with the blasphemous contempt of an unscoured anchorite. The body is of all things the most unpleasant and most foul. It is astonishing that we should love a thing to which we perform such strange services every day. I fill this bag, then I empty it. What is more troublesome? There are passages that breathe the piety of Augustine with the eloquence of Newman. Use me henceforward, O God, as thou wilt. I am of one mind with thee. I am thine. I ask exemption from nothing that seems good in thy sight. Where thou wilt, lead me. In what raiment thou wilt, clothe me. And like Jesus, he bids his disciples take no care of the morrow. To have God as our Maker, Father, and Guardian, shall not this suffice to keep us from grief and fear? And wherewithal shall I be fed, asks one, if I have nothing? But what shall we say of the animals, every one of which is sufficient to itself, and lacks neither its own proper food nor that way of life which is appropriate to it, and in harmony with nature? Is it any wonder that Christians like St. John Chrysostom and Augustine lauded him, and that his Enchiridion was adopted with minor changes as a rule and guide for the monastic life? Who knows but that Epictetus had read in some form the sayings of Jesus and was, without knowing it, a convert to Christianity? 4. Lucian and the Skeptics. Nevertheless, in this final stage of Hellenistic culture, there were skeptics who recalled all the doubts of Protagoras, and a Lucian who laughed at belief with the insolence of Aristippus and almost Plato's charm. The school of Pyrrho was not dead, and Nicodemus of Knossos rephrased its denials in the Alexandria of our 1st century by propounding the famous 10 modes, or tropoi, or contradictions that made knowledge impossible. Towards the end of the 2nd century, Sextus Empiricus, of unknown date or place, gave the skeptical philosophy its final formulation in several destructive volumes, of which 3 survive. Sextus takes all the world for his enemy. He divides philosophers into diverse species and slays each breed in turn. He writes with the vigor necessary to an executioner, the good order and clarity characteristic of ancient philosophy, occasional sarcastic humor, and much dreary chopping of logic. To every argument, says Sextus, an equal argument can be opposed, so that in the end there is nothing so superfluous as reasoning. This book is continued on Cassette 6, Side 1.